Liberalism, section, from the 19th to the 20th century. In the years leading up to the outbreak of the Second 30 Years' War, we witness the accumulation of a mass of explosive material. At the end of the 19th century, corresponding to the formation of the Liberty and Property Defense League in England, was the formation of the White Leagues and the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. At stake was halting or reversing the two struggles for recognition with which we are familiar. Across the Atlantic, the restoration of white supremacy registered its triumph as early as 1877. In Europe, the Liberty and Property Defense League would have to wait until 1922 to record its first victory in Italy. The persistent unrest of servants or ex-servants in the metropolis, and of slaves or ex-slaves in the colonies or of colonial origin, and the increasing aggressiveness of the social and political circles that felt threatened by these two agitations, were compounded by contradictions within the community of the free and of Teutonic stock, previously celebrated in its entirety as the chosen people, or race of liberty, which now tended to assume an antagonistic form. Moreover, these multiple conflicts were further exacerbated by an ideological climate marked by the assertion of trends, social Darwinism, a radical reinterpretation of history and conspiracy theory, present from the outset in the liberal tradition, but which now met with ever weaker resistance, rendering a rational understanding and limitation of the conflict impossible. Not by chance have we heard two deadly slogans echo. The first declared that race is everything. The second invoked the ultimate solution, or the final and complete solution, of the racial question. The degree of continuity between the 19th and 20th centuries has not escaped a whole series of scholars who cannot be suspected of a preconceived hostility to the liberal world. While she generously overlooked the North American Republic, which had had the merit of offering her refuge, Hannah Arendt explained the genesis of 20th century totalitarianism, commencing with the colonies of the British Empire. It was here that, quote, a new form of government, a more dangerous form of governing than despotism and arbitrariness, end quote, saw the light of day, and where the temptation of administrative massacres, as an instrument for maintaining domination, began to emerge. But especially interesting in this context is the fact that not a few U.S. scholars, in order to explain the history of their country, have turned to the category of master race democracy, or Herrenvolk democracy, in an eloquent linguistic admixture of English and German, and a German that in several respects refers to the history of the Third Reich. Not only the concentration camp universe as a whole, but also the individual total institutions of the 20th century, began to take shape well before the end of the supposed Belle Epoque. We may begin with deportation. The successive bloody deportations of Indians, starting with the one implemented by Jackson's America, held up as a model of democracy by Tocqueville, recall the, quote, horrors created by the Nazi handling of subject peoples, end quote. The Indians were not the only victims of this practice. The slave trade represented, quote, the largest involuntary movement of human beings in all of history, end quote. The deportees were subsequently forced to work in a slave plantation that bore some similarities to the concentration camp. The comparison does not seem exaggerated. Precisely in this context, the process of dehumanization reached levels that were difficult to match. In Jamaica, in the liberal British Empire of the mid-18th century, we find a type of punishment at work that speaks volumes. Quote, a slave was forced to defecate into the offending slave's mouth, which was then wired shut for 4 or 5 hours, end quote. Even his completely innocent fellow slaves were forced to participate in the dehumanization of the victim, and, with him, of the ethnic group. Should all this not seem sufficiently cruel, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, white supremacy was imposed in the United States. Beginning of long quote. Notices of lynchings were printed in local papers, and extra cars added to trains for spectators from miles around, sometimes thousands of them. School children might get a day off school to attend the lynching. The spectacle can include castration, skinning, roasting, hanging, and shooting. Souvenirs for purchasers might include fingers, toes, teeth, and bones, even genitals of the victim, as well as picture postcards of the event." End quote. Once again, we encounter a process of dehumanization difficult to emulate. First in the North, and then, after the Civil War, in the South, notionally free blacks suffered humiliation and persecution of every kind. In fact, stresses a historian in language that once again demands our attention, they became the target of veritable, quote, pogroms. Carrying them out were the gangs already active in the North in the 1820s and 30s, and which later, in the South, achieved consummate form in the Ku Klux Klan, an organization that seems to anticipate the black shirts of Italian fascism and the brown shirts of German Nazism. No less brutal than the extra-legal violence was official justice. In the South, blacks continued to be subject to a prison system so sadistic that it calls to mind, quote, the prison camps of Nazi Germany. End quote. In any event, the two situations were united by the violence of racist ideology. Theodore Roosevelt can calmly be approximated to Hitler. Over and above individual figures, we must not lose sight of the general picture. Quote, the effort to guarantee race purity in the American South anticipated aspects of the official Nazi persecution of the Jews in the 30s. End quote. If we bear in mind the rule whereby a single drop of impure blood was enough for someone to be excluded from the white community in the South of the United States, a conclusion dictates itself. Quote, the Nazi definition of a Jew was never as stringent as the one-drop rule that prevailed in the categorization of Negroes in the race purity laws of the American South. End quote. Again, two U.S. scholars have recently referred to the Nazi connection, or the American legacy, present in Nazism, to explain the parabola of eugenics, the science born in liberal England and massively diffused in the other classic country of that intellectual tradition, which experienced its greatest triumphs in the Third Reich. In this connection, we have in fact encountered a paradox. Having disappeared together with Hitler's Germany, eugenic measures continued to survive for some time in the United States. Let us observe the situation in 1952. Quote, at the present time, some 30 states in the Union legally forbid interracial marriage. In almost all these states, miscegenation is a felony. In many, a crime. End quote. Regarded as elements of contamination were not only Negroes, but also, in this or that state, mulattoes, Indians, Mongolians, Koreans, members of the Malay race, Chinese, or any person of Negro or Indian descent to the third generation inclusive, or even anyone having 1/8 or more Negro, Japanese, or Chinese blood, or even someone with 1/4 or more Kanak Hawaiian blood. End quote. Reporting these facts is a U.S. scholar who feels obliged to draw a bitter conclusion in respect of racism and Nazism. Quote, the monster that has been let loose upon the world is, to a large extent, of our own making, and whether we are willing to face the fact or not, we are, all of us, individually and collectively, responsible for the ghastly form which he has assumed." End quote. Finally, genocide. An eminent scholar, Stefan Todorov, has defined the destruction of the Indians, whose final chapter was written in the English colonies in America and then in the United States, as the greatest genocide in human history. As for the tragedy of the natives in America, Australia, or the British colonies in general, other authors have referred respectively to the American Holocaust, or the final solution of the Amerindian question, the Australian Holocaust, and late Victorian Holocausts. Not to mention the Black Holocaust, the deportation and enslavement of the survivors, who numbered 1 in 3 or 4, that Afro-Americans seek to draw attention to, and whose main protagonist was the liberal world. Finally, branded as the author of a tragedy to be regarded as the prototype of 20th century genocides, the principal official, Sir Charles Edward Trevelyan, of the British policy that led to the death from starvation of hundreds of thousands of Irish in the mid-19th century, has sometimes been defined as the, quote, proto-Eichmann. This is not the place to proceed to a comparative history of massacres, decimations, and genocides, or to discuss the pertinence of the categories employed to describe them. But one point seems to me to be settled. It is banally ideological to characterize the catastrophe of the 20th century as a kind of new barbarian invasion that unexpectedly attacked and overwhelmed a healthy, happy society. The horror of the 20th century casts a shadow over the liberal world, even if we ignore the fate reserved for peoples of colonial origin. Quote, totalitarian society thus has been defined the one that swallowed up deportees from Britain and Australia. And with particular reference to the development of industrial capitalism in England, it has been claimed that, quote, the Gulag is not a 20th century invention, end quote. The usual hagiography proves unfounded, even when, in reconstructing the liberal world, we restrict ourselves to analyzing the metropolis and the white community. Let us take an author celebrated by de Tocqueville as the apex of the liberal tradition. Jefferson raised the specter of genocide in 3 very different contexts. He referred to extermination, in connection with the Indians, as a process that was underway in the United States, could not be stopped, and was in fact to be attributed exclusively to the British. He pointed to the extermination of the blacks as the inevitable outcome of the utopia of constructing a multiracial society. Finally, he experienced the clash with Britain as a total war, destined to issue in the extermination of one of the contending parties. As we can see, even a conflict completely internal to the community of the free provoked an ideological violence that might as well bring to mind the 20th century. End of section.